Clive Stafford Smith is an Anglo-American human rights lawyer. Sorry, Sally. A human rights lawyer who spent 32 years in the US defending prisoners on death row, and after 9/11, bringing the first litigation to open up Guantanamo Bay, before founding the legal action charity Reprieve and returning to the UK. In between continuing this work, he's currently focused on opening up what he calls Guantanamo on the Euphrates, the detention camps maintained due to the European pressure, keeping detainees from returning home to the rule of law.
Hello, Denmark. I'm very sorry not to be there. This is Clive Stafford Smith. I'm in deepest Dorset, or I might be in America. I'm not quite sure by the time you get to see this. But I wish I could be there, and I'm sorry I'm not. But it's great you're having this conference on what I refer to as Guantanamo on the Euphrates. And part of the problem I have is that I'm still dealing with the other Guantanamo over in Cuba. And I thought today I wasn't going to just talk about everything. I thought I'd just focus on one aspect of this, which is whether we can replicate some of the due process that we were able to bring in Guantanamo way back when, in 2002, February, that we brought the first case in Guantanamo, and gradually solve the problem in Syria. And there are two things, and I'll talk about them as we go through. But first, this is only one aspect. The greatest sin that any of us can commit is to do nothing. But beyond that, pretty much anything goes. And what I'm going to talk about is just one facet of what I hope is a very broad way of trying to solve some of the problems. And the other issue on this is it's going to take a long time. I've been working on Guantanamo now for 19 years. And while we've had some great success, and we've personally, the group of people I work with have got 80 people out. And overall, we've got 740 of the 780 people out. Nevertheless, there are still 40 people in Guantanamo 2 decades later. So it's a big problem. I should just mention before we go on that I'm afraid when I do PowerPoint displays, they always have pictures of my son, who's now 12, but I still use the ones when he's quite young, because he keeps telling me not to do it. And it's embarrassing, but at least no one can recognize him now. So let's go forward. I'm going to talk just about whether we can create a system to have local trials for the detainees in northeast Syria. And, that's only one facet. Obviously, we'd all like to just have them come home. But we can't snap our fingers and unnecessarily demand that. And they call it the, whatever it is, administration of northeast Syria. I've always thought we should call it the self-administration area of northeast Syria, because that's sane Syria, as opposed to the mad Assad, who's the one who deals with the rest of Syria. But anyway, I'll call it by their name through this. And Einstein said this, that there are two things that are infinite, the universe and human stupidity, and he's not sure about the universe, but he's certain that humans are incredibly stupid. And one thing that's happened over the last 20 years since 9/11, and I speak as half American and half British, and actually I apologize for both of them at this point, is that the things that we've done, the policies we've applied, have made the world a vastly more dangerous place, not a better place, because we've abandoned our basic principles of presuming people innocent, of giving them trials, of all that sort of thing. And it's that sort of hypocrisy that breeds hatred around the world. There was indeed a intelligence officer in Guantanamo when I was first going there who said for every prisoner we have there, we've provoked 10 people around the world to want to do us harm. I think he was underestimating it then, and he's certainly underestimating it now. I think that if you consider the list of all the members of Al-Qaeda on September the 10th, 2001, which was found when bin Laden was assassinated, there were like 100 people on a one-page list. And because we've behaved so badly over the last 20 years, we have made people think that everything we say about democracy and decency and whatever is just nonsense. Legal term is bullshit. And as a consequence, people have been disenchanted with the West and have gone for some of these mad other supposed solutions for our world. And that's in large part, in a very significant part, due to the way that we've responded to the issues in front of us. And one thing we need to do, all of us, is to recognize that actually the Kurds are not the bad guys here. The Kurds in northeast Syria don't want to be forced to run Guantanamo on the Euphrates. And indeed, I've been there a few times, and I've always been impressed with the level of participation in democracy. You know, which other countries have a system where you have to have one male and one female co-chair of each part of the government? I mean, that's better than Britain, and it's certainly better than America. And they don't want to do this, which is an important factor. But at the same time, it's difficult because they're in a dreadful situation and they're constantly being undermined by the West and stabbed in the back and so forth. But it's important not to hate them. And it's important to look at where the real problem lies, which I think in large part is that chap on the left there, Boris Johnson. You know, we have all these politicians on the West saying, oh, this is a massive problem and the West can't deal with anything. Well, it's not. It's actually really easy for the West, and it's just a political issue where they're exploiting hatred. But it's a real problem for the Kurds. And so I want to talk a bit about the lessons we learn from Guantanamo and the comparisons, because I think it's useful to think about that in terms of how we might approach northeast Syria. The first and most important thing, actually, is that starting on this, the reason I was able to get in to begin with, before I think there were certain forces that would rather keep lawyers out, was that the Kurds really didn't want to have a legal black hole, whereas it took us 2.5 years to get in for the very first time to Guantanamo Bay. We sued on February the 19th, 2002, and we won in the US Supreme Court in June 2004. And for 2.5 years, no one was able to visit anyone in a prison in Guantanamo. They could go there and have a propaganda tour where they were told all this nonsense about how everyone was so evil, but they could, the media could, but they couldn't talk to any prisoner. And those prisoners were all held totally incommunicado. And we didn't have a list of the people who were in Guantanamo until 2006, so that was 4 years on. All of that was considered secret. I got into Gitmo for the first time in late 2004. And I was one of the first people to do that. But this is a big problem, and at least the Kurds don't want it. But, you know, the sad truth is that the hostility to the prisoners is very similar. You know, you may think now that the West is actually generally opposed to Guantanamo Bay, and even the President of the United States is. But that wasn't true in the early days. And when we brought the litigation on behalf of the prisoners, I remember I went on television, which was really unwise, and I was accused of being a traitor to the United States 13 times in a 5-minute interview. And, you know, the death threats I got that night were quite lurid. And even in Europe at the beginning, the European countries were firmly on the American side after 9/11. It wasn't for a couple of years that we started to get traction, even in European countries. So it's a big battle. One of the really interesting aspects of the comparison between the two Guantanamos is, you know, in Gitmo, eventually, everyone came to see the United States as the bad guys. And I always say this about Europe, you know, our national sport is not the Euro football, our national sport is bashing America, which, when you've got Trump or Bush as president, is a remarkably easy game to do. And we really enjoyed doing that over Guantanamo. But what's a bit shocking today is that the shoe is on the other foot now. And the real problem here are the British and the other Europeans and the Canadians who have gone along with them. Because even Donald Trump, you won't say this very often, you certainly won't hear me say it very often, Donald Trump was right and all the Western Europe governments were wrong. Trump said that we should take all our people back, and the Americans did. I actually was involved in the very first American case, and it was quite easy to force the US to take their nationals home. And yeah, they've prosecuted some of them, but it's just not been a big deal for America, with the single exception of Hodamathana, where Trump did one of his midnight mad tweets. But other than that, the Americans have taken all of their people home and helped a lot of other countries. And the problem here was really the British. I mean, the best example one can give of that is the experience of the Canadians. And I was somewhat involved in that 2 or 3 years ago, when the Canadians had originally reached an agreement. They'd had meetings with the Kurds. They had a memorandum of understanding about how they were going to take what they then thought was about 25 of their citizens back. They'd done passport applications. They'd done everything. And then, and this is clearly true, although obviously they'll deny it for political embarrassment reasons, it's clearly true that the mother country, acting rather paternalistically, ironically, Britain told Canada not to do it. And Canada suddenly stopped this process of bringing their nationals back. And Canada's been just as useless as Britain since then. But the problem was the British, and the British have promoted this ridiculous concept of Guantanamo on the Euphrates ever since. And they've been, from my experience, the main bad guys in all of this, which is too bad. And the Brits have gone around and started this whole nonsense about stripping nationality. The Americans, again, don't do that. There's a case from 1954 where the United States Supreme Court said that taking your American nationality is worse than executing you, which is arguable, obviously, but that's a very British thing to do, and it's very pernicious, and we're seeing it in other countries, Australia and various places, stripping people of nationality too, something we need to fight. Another comparison which is important to take into account is the size. When we dealt with Guantanamo in Cuba, there were 780 detainees from 46 countries. They were all men, and that was the bad side, because it was easier for the government to pretend that they all were bad dudes captured on the battlefield of Afghanistan, which turned out to be total bullshit. They were actually people who were sold to America for bounties, by and large. But still, it was a manageable number of people. One of our big problems on the Euphrates is we've got 100 times as many people. And even when you just look at the so-called foreign detainees, who are the ones considered not to be Syrian or Iraqi, they're from a similar number of countries, but there's just, 20 times as many people. And that makes this a massive, massive problem compared to Guantanamo. The good side, of course, is that there are a huge number of kids and a lot of women. And it's much easier to advocate for children than it is for bearded men who can be demonized, or even for some of the women. And that certainly provoked what's been my strategy in the limited work I've been able to do on this, which has been to focus first on the orphans, then on the kids, then on the women and kids. And we mustn't forget the men, of course, but they're the difficult political issue. And we have got some men out. I mean, the Americans have taken their men back. But this is a big, big problem, and we need to recognize that. The next real problem, which is why it's so important you're having this conference in Denmark, is in terms of resources. To begin with, in Guantanamo in the US, it was just me and 2 other lawyers. So it was very small. But as the case percolated up to the US Supreme Court, a lot of other people came out of the woodwork and started getting interested and seeing it for what it was, which was anathema to the whole concept of the rule of law and the essence of America. And in the end, we had a cadre of 500 plus pro bono lawyers, many of them from big law firms with huge amounts of money. Because, of course, all of this has to be done for nothing. We were forced to sign in Guantanamo agreements. Before we could go down to Guantanamo, we had to sign something saying we'd never seek funding from the United States government and we'd always pay for everything ourselves. But we did also have the history of habeas corpus, which is something, it's actually written in the US Constitution. You don't have to go to the Bill of Rights to see the right to habeas corpus. And that's how legally we got into Guantanamo. And it was also a big benefit that Cuba was a long way from anything. I mean, it was very hard for anyone to say these guys were a threat to anybody when they were in Cuba, which was, over 12,000 kilometers from the so-called battlefield. It was a downside that the US had so much money. I mean, they currently spend $11.8 million per detainee per year. I think they've spent a total of $6 billion to hold these essentially almost nobodies, most of the people in Guantanamo. So then you compare it to Guantanamo on the Euphrates, and, it's an enormous problem when we have none of the resources. So far, I think it's true to say that in terms of the lawyers who have actually got in to try to represent people, there's only been a couple of us. And the local lawyers, I've talked to some of them, but they don't have any resources either. They have this sort of mad 2014 terrorism law that is never going to go anywhere. It's incredibly badly written and would cause them all sorts of legal problems. They're not 12,000 kilometers away. The SDF is forced to keep on fighting on every front if they're not being attacked by mad Assad or by other ISIS lunatics. They're being attacked by Turkey, and it's really difficult for them. And they have very little funds. They have a hard enough time feeding their own people, let alone prisoners, thousands of prisoners that they have. So it's a very different and very difficult situation in that sense, and it's why it's so important for all of you to be involved. And, you have a real problem there too. Yes, eventually we won in Guantanamo in the US Supreme Court, but the Bush administration carried on fighting us. So we won in Rasul versus Bush, which was the case we brought on behalf of 3 British people who were being held there. But then the US government tried to push back, and we had to go up to the US Supreme Court 2 more times to maintain even the basic rights that we had. But at least we had the US Supreme Court and we had a constitution. And the problem in Northeast Syria is that legal rights are meaningless unless there's a way to enforce them. And I've had people in Syria ask if we can't sue, the prisoners ask if we can't sue the UN or sue this person or sue that person. But actually it's impossible to do in many cases. And so it's very hard to find a legal forum where we can enforce the rights of people, which is why we may need to help create one. All of these things are pretty multinational. It's not to say that you can't bring litigation in other countries. I definitely planned to when I was doing the American cases, because we could force the American government quite easily in court to do their job in terms of helping people. And, when you think about the US passport or the British passport, for that matter, and most of your others, it says right there on the inside front page that it's their duty to provide support to people when they're in trouble abroad. And we could have enforced that in the US because we have a constitution. We should definitely try to do it in other cases, as has been done a bit in Britain and done quite successfully in some of the continental European countries. And it's worth thinking that, we won in the US Supreme Court in 2004 on Guantanamo, but we'd only won once by 2006. And we'd won more cases in Britain that we'd brought suing the British or suing other people in Britain. So this multinational approach is really important. And the fact that there are so many people there in Denmark from different countries is really important because, again, it's good to coordinate, but the bottom line is you do whatever you want. And I don't think you have much chance of doing any harm. I'll tell you one story about Guantanamo. People would bitch and complain about what each other did and, you shouldn't do that or you should do that. But actually, there was nothing that harmed what we did, however crazy. And there was one lawyer who I'd gone to Yemen with. I won't name him, but he had this ridiculous idea of trying to illustrate how degrading Guantanamo was. And so, to illustrate the way that the US government was degrading the prisoners, he stripped to his Y-front underpants. And this was a sort of 60-year-old white guy from Washington. And he just horrified the conservative Muslims in the audience. Quite understandably so. The Y-fronts are not great pants, are they? But anyway, even that didn't do any harm except his legal career, because he got fired by his firm. But, there was no harm done to what we were trying to do, however mad that was. So the absolute lesson is no matter where you are and what you're doing, as long as you're doing, it's almost certainly a good thing. One aspect of all of this is, while courts are important at some level, the court of public opinion is much more important. And one of the reasons that we need to get into northeast Syria is to get the truth out. It was Joe Margulis, one of the two other lawyers who I worked with on Guantanamo, who said of that place that that was only being used because then the Bush administration could say we were doing something to these evil, wicked people who had been behind 9/11. And all of that was a lie. And Joe said, if we open it up, they'll close it down because the people would see the truth. And then suddenly they wouldn't be so supportive of it. And the same is true in Syria. And it's really worth underlining the fact that while we had a court that we could go to in America, actually the American law on this subject was pretty stupid. And it was really important to use the law to get in to see the prisoners. But it didn't help getting the prisoners out, because the DC Circuit Court of Appeals held that the courts couldn't order the release of the prisoners. So actually, of the 740 people we've got out, 0 have been released as a result of a court order. And they've all been released ultimately because of public pressure. And so we would go to visit the prisoners. Everything was secretive. We couldn't say anything until we got it through the censors. But in the end, we were able to get the truth out about so many prisoners that it was just embarrassing to the US government and shamed them into releasing so many prisoners. And 740 out of 780 is also almost 95% that we've got out so far. And there are now 40 left, but we've already cleared 8 of them. So that's another 25% of them who'll get out pretty soon. And that's all really been through getting the facts out. And we've seen the same sort of vilification of prisoners in northeast Syria that we saw elsewhere. And yet we need to not vilify the people who have done those stories. I was really happy to see something just last week where the journalist who had first created the whole stigma for poor old Shamima Begum, the kid, she was 15 from Britain when she went to northeast Syria. The person who wrote the early stories on that made her look so bad has written a really good piece for the Times about how she's no threat to Britain. And I've talked to him personally about it, and I'm very pleased that he's felt guilty about it and went back to try to repair some of the damage. But we need to keep that up. Then, one of the issues I want to talk about is just about whether we shouldn't be trying to help them create a legal system where we can get people out. And I think we should. And there are various questions. Lawyers argue about this stuff forever, and it's such nonsense. Of course they can do that. I mean, of course they can create whatever court they want. They don't need to have anyone's permission. I mean, the Nuremberg trials were just created. Guantanamo, the Americans just created military commissions. And there's no reason that a subsection of a country, even just northeast Syria, couldn't do that. Of course they can. And, they can do it even when much of the so-called offense took place elsewhere. This chap here, Marion Albert Mad Dog Pruitt, was someone I represented facing the death penalty in the US. And he did a spree kidnapping with a bunch of murders involved that went all the way along I-10, which goes all the way from California to Florida. And, each state could try him. He was tried in the end in New Mexico, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Florida for the things that happened all the way along the route. So, of course, the Northeast Syrians can try people for whatever. As long as there's some link to that, they have perfect power to try people there for whatever happened anywhere in Syria. But there are practical difficulties they face. I mean, if there are 13,000 foreign detainees, it's crazy to think that these cash-strapped people can do all those trials. Of course they can't. So, we're thinking about trials not as a way to release everybody and try everybody. Of course not. It's just a mechanism to put pressure on the Western governments to behave themselves and take people back. And, I've talked to the people in Northeast Syria at various levels about why they want to do it. They're the victims. They do have the right to put people on trial much more than anywhere else. Not that the British shouldn't be doing it. Of course they should, and so should everyone else if they've got any evidence. But the Syrians can too, Northeast Syrians. But, it's also good for them because we've talked about it. And I've got to say, I'd rather be tried in a court by the Kurds than in a court by a number of other people, including probably the Americans, because they're not as vindictive. And so, but it's only as a way to highlight, if we did trials in Northeast Syria, and it'd just be a few, the media would be all over them. And we need to have those things done in part to show that there's a lot of people who aren't guilty of anything. And so we want to highlight that. We want to have people, people like me, for goodness sake, go down and help human rights lawyers to make sure that they have fairness and that people are acquitted. And, if we do that, we can change the story and gradually move everyone towards sending people home. And we can do it with all the human rights provisions. One thing I like about the Kurds is, they have no truck with the death penalty, and they'd like to have it all human rights compliant. So, it's important for us to try to use that as one tool for helping to solve the problem in Northeast Syria. And we should take the parallel with Nuremberg, where they provided counsel for the person in the language they spoke. So they got German lawyers to represent them. But they also, Nuremberg, one thing people don't remember is even in the trial of the very worst Nazis, the Nuremberg tribunals acquitted 5 of 24 people. Over 20% of them were found not guilty. And of all the 12,000 plus trials they had of Nazis after World War II, a third of them were acquitted, were found not guilty. And so what that does is highlight everything. Yes, you've got the mad people who really were doing crazy, mad things, but you've also got people who weren't. And one of the good ways to get that story out is if we can do it in a courtroom where people are acquitted. And we can all think of people who, if they were put on trial, would be fine. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but some of the Canadians who I'm well familiar with, we know that so many of the women who ended up in Northeast Syria were coerced or were trafficked or were stupid 15-year-old kids. And also, I put a word in for Jack Letts here, because I'm sure at some point John and Sally will be listening to this, and they know, and I know, that Jack's no more a terrible terrorist than my grandmother. And I would like nothing more than to represent Jack in a trial down there, because, yeah, he'd probably be convicted of coming illegally into the country and being a bit of a twit, but he's not going to be convicted of being a terrorist. And we'd do that very publicly. And I've met Jack down there. He's a nice kid, and he would speak well for himself. And so, those are just things we need to think about when we're thinking about whether we want to try to help them do it. But again, with those cases or with anything, it's in the interests of the Kurds as well as us to start off with the most sympathetic cases at some level. And, that's why I went down there, the very first people we actually had to get out, as opposed to the Americans, who were very easy, with these 2 Trinidadian kids, because they were just effectively orphans. And, it was really good to get the publicity for them. But we want to do the same with any trials we might do. And if people are convicted of something minor and are sentenced to some minor offense, and what the Kurds have said to me is they don't expect anyone to get more than a 20-year sentence, but most people would get something very minimal. And if they've done their time and facing time served, or if they're kids and they're obviously acquitted, then the pressure is stepped up on the Western countries to take them home. And that's really the point of doing it from my perspective. But I hope we can keep on working towards that as one idea. Anyway, none of that really matters in the great scheme of things. I only wanted to talk about these few ideas because of the ultimate rule in what we're all trying to do, which is that we're trying to do something. I think as a group of people, we didn't have much backbiting in the Guantanamo cases. It was just a bunch of stupid stuff every now and then. But the bottom line is people really got along and respected each other doing whatever they did. And obviously that's true for us. Anything that you do is good. The only sin is to do nothing. And pretty much anything. Look, we have a test I used to have in the office I ran in New Orleans, which was called the triple laugh test. And if you have an idea that's so stupid that just everyone bursts out laughing at you, then it's probably not going to do any harm anyhow, so I should go ahead and do it. But almost never would people have ideas when we were doing death penalty trials that we would reject as being harmful, because almost nothing is harmful except to do nothing. And so I encourage you to not just listen to what I have to say, but to listen to what everyone has to say, and then crack on and get on down to Syria yourself and do whatever you can do. Or if you can't do that, there's any number of things you can do to highlight the plight of people up here. And I suppose that's about it. This is a particularly embarrassing picture of Wilf, dressed up as Robin Hood, who I'm sure many of you will know as he's certainly my hero, who went around doing battle with the evil Prince John in England in about 1100 and something. But anyway, that's Wilf being dressed up by me as Robin Hood. And we all need to do it ourselves. We need to get out there and do whatever we can to help solve this huge problem of Guantanamo on the Euphrates. And with that, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry I can't be there in person. It'd be nice to meet you all in person. But it's good to be able to talk to you a bit from here. And I hope we'll work together on this for the years to come, which will be years to come, I'm afraid. Thanks.